Hello to our viewers and listeners. This is episode lucky number 13 of Coronavirus Conversations. And unfortunately, two in a row. Hopefully this is not going to start a new trend, but Josh is busy again at the Gable Health Center. So Josh will not be able to join us today. So that's a bummer. But what is exciting is we have Hilary Aquino with us today. Hi, Hilary. Welcome.
Hello. Morning.
Morning. And so today it's November 24th. This is the last day of the semester. How have things been going for you this semester?
They've been going pretty well. I taught the beginning of the semester on campus, and now I'm teaching. Just finished my public health class online, so a mixture.
A mixture, right? And for those of you who maybe don't know, if you're listening off campus, we are doing a sort of split semester this year. And so what Hilary was referencing is session one, which ran for about 7.5 weeks or so, was in person, and then apparently Hilary, the next 7.5 week session was online, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I got to teach my history of medicine course the beginning in fall one, and now public health in fall two. So.
Right, very cool. Yeah, I have a lot of, obviously I have a lot of pre-med advisees, and a lot of those students tend to like to take that course because it's very interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I enjoy having them. They're always very good students.
I'm glad to hear. Well, you let me know if they're not, all right? So Hilary, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Like, like where are you from? Where'd you go to college? What's your training? What brought you to Albright College?
So I am from Manhattan. That's where I went to high school. I went to Dickinson College in Carlisle for my undergraduate, and then I went to Stony Brook University on Long Island for my master's and Ph.D. And my area of specialization is the history of medicine and public health. So I'm fortunate in that I'm able to teach that at Albright. And then I also help administer the public health program here, and I teach the introductory course. And then Professor Langren and I are also going to be teaching a course on pandemics in spring of 2021. So I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, she had reached out to see if I wanted to contribute a little bit, and I happened to be on sabbatical. I would have loved to have jumped in a little bit because that sounds really neat. As you know, we were just saying I could talk about this stuff all day long. But, yeah, that would have been neat to kind of help with that in some way. But yeah, I just happened to be on sabbatical this year. So, well, good luck with that. It sounds like a very interesting class.
Thanks. So my area of research over the past few years has been looking at, and it was related to my dissertation, it's sort of a follow-up on that, up the first female head of the Department of Health of New York City.
Okay.
Was in office from 1954 to 1962. So a lot of my recent research has looked at her use of the media in communicating public health messages. So combination of, at the time, radio, but also the fairly new medium of television.
Wow.
And she oversaw the polio vaccine trials in New York, which was a major undertaking.
Do you happen to know, were they using the vaccine from Salk or Sabin at that time?
Salk.
Salk, okay.
Salk vaccine trial. The Sabin vaccine was not available till a little bit later, but she did also utilize that because, as you know, it's a little bit easier to administer than the Salk, but the big vaccine trial was the Salk.
Right. And just so people are aware, the Salk vaccine is the killed or inactivated vaccine that we still get in this country today. It's the shot, and whereas the Sabin is an oral vaccine. But one of the problems with the Sabin vaccine is that when it passes through the GI tract and the vaccinated person basically passes it out in their stool, it can actually revert. It can reverse and go back to almost a wild type version of polio and actually cause vaccine associated polio. So as we're trying to eradicate polio, we're trying to switch as much as we can to the Salk inactivated, which again is killed, you can't replicate. So we use the Salk vaccine, I think exclusively in this country. Is that correct?
That's my understanding.
Yeah, I
But
think
for
so.
So it was used in New York. The Sabin vaccine was used in the city in 1962. I'm not sure about after that.
Right, but I think like in modern times, I
Yeah.
believe 100% inactivated Salk. And so it's so interesting. Like I feel like scientists aren't really as famous nowadays as they once were, because I mean Jonas Salk. I mean he's famous. He was on the cover of Time magazine, um, and that's just something that you don't really see too much nowadays for whatever reason.
Well, that sort of links into some things I've been thinking about in preparation for our discussion today, one of which is both in 1918 and today, the public's trust in science and public health officials,
Mm-hmm.
and the notion of compliance or lack of compliance with guidelines. So there were non-compliant people in 1918 as well as today. So I think that's an area that is rich for historic exploration, right?
Right, and another example that comes to mind is, so I happen to do research on a pox virus, and so I'm very interested in pox viruses. And back in I guess it'd be the early 1800s when Jenner and his contemporaries were trying to get cowpox vaccine, to help protect against smallpox. Very effective vaccine, almost 100% effective against stopping smallpox disease. But I've seen, and I shared this with my students, there's some political cartoons of people getting the cowpox vaccine of Jenner, and then in the cartoon you can see them morphing into a cow with horns and everything. And so even something, I mean, smallpox can kill upwards of 40% of people that get it. It's way more dangerous than the pandemic now. And yet, even in the face of that, there was still pushback among some people to begin to getting that vaccine, getting protected against smallpox. And I guess there's always sort of a small undercurrent of either distrust or something. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we do a unit on smallpox in my history of medicine course. So one of the interesting aspects of it is the big controversy in Boston, right? So it really interesting. The proponent of smallpox in Boston was a Puritan minister named Cotton Mather, who was extremely influential and actually wrote a number of pieces that were published in London, the proceedings of the Royal Science Society. And some people, although not all, his main opponent was an MD, William Douglas,
Okay.
who was against the smallpox vaccine. And there was a big pamphlet war and a newspaper war in Boston between the people who were pro-vaccine, or inoculation as they called it, and anti. And it got so intense that someone threw a firebomb into Cotton Mather's house.
Wow.
That's how contentious this was. And it was tied in with religion, because even though he was a minister, the people who were against it said it was a practice that was that originated in non-Christian parts of the world. It was really, and that you shouldn't, it interfered with God's will. There were some scientific arguments against it as well, and that there wasn't a consistent way to administer it. And of course, you could expose someone to another bloodborne pathogen by doing it. But
and correct me if I'm wrong, Hilary, but wasn't it also, I mean, today we would never make a vaccine this way, but didn't they inoculate the cowpox, or what we call vaccinia virus today, onto like the shaved hide of a calf, right? And they would and the calf or the cow would get these pustules oozing this fluid. They would collect it and process it, dry it. So I mean, who knows what ended up being in that vaccine? So it could be somewhat dangerous, but it was still in the end, though, just looking solely at the science of it, it was still safer and a very good vaccine relative to getting smallpox.
Yeah.
Um,
Yes.
we would never make a vaccine that way today. So I think that's part of it too. You could get some bacterial infections and some, other severe reactions because it wasn't exactly a very pure vaccine formulation. So.
And also the idea of, so people in that time period, you're taking someone who's healthy,
Right.
right? Ostensibly, basically making a cut on their skin and putting a foreign substance there. I mean, that whole concept, I think we have to try and, well, as a historian, I always tell my students, try to think the way people thought during that time period, not in a 2020 perspective. So pre-germ theory, et cetera, et cetera.
That's an important skill to have, the ability to put yourself in another person's shoes. So that's cool. So I guess what we'll do, we gathered here to talk primarily about the 1918 Spanish influenza pandemic. So what I thought I would do is just give a very brief overview of influenza, and then we can sort of use that as a backdrop for the rest of our discussion. So I'm just going to share just a few slides today of what I show to some of my biology and biochemistry undergraduates that I have in Bio 329, which is virology. And so interestingly, I'll just sort of show this here, and there we go. So it's interesting that, flu is another pathogen like the current SARS-CoV-2. It's another pathogen of the respiratory tract. And I guess in some ways it makes sense that a pandemic is most likely going to occur from something that is easily spread and highly contagious. And so, I guess something that's, respiratory spread, you spew it out in the air, I guess it makes sense at some level. If something that's sexually transmitted only or bloodborne only, probably not going to become a pandemic. So influenza primarily infects the upper respiratory tract. So here, cells of the upper airway, the upper nasal cavity, and somewhat into the upper airway. But the strains that tend to be more severe can often find their way into the lower airway, all the way down into the lungs and into the air sacs, and it can cause a lot of problems, including fluid buildup and all kinds of problems with getting oxygen to your body. And it can be severe. It can be severe. This is something that is an interesting topic here on this slide. You'll notice first off the word estimated, and that's a little odd because why don't we know exactly how many people get infected in this country, right? Especially a developed, ostensibly rich with resources country. Why don't we know? And it just depends on flu. Often itself does not kill, but it sort of indirectly predisposes someone to maybe a bacterial pneumonia or some other complication. And so on a death certificate, it might not say influenza, yet influenza was the precipitating event. And so this is from the CDC. And you can see that in black here are the number of sort of confirmed cases of influenza on death certificates. And in red, it's estimated. And so you can see, it does depend on the year. But if you look at some of these years, Hilary, it's 40, 50, 60,000 cases of flu-related deaths. And it's really interesting that, that's every single year, anywhere from 10 to maybe 60,000 people die as a result of flu infection. And I feel like it's not something that people really talk about or take that seriously. Did you by chance want to comment on that?
Yes. And that's one of the sort of noticeable events surrounding the 1918, 1919 pandemic. So people were used to flu, and we are used to flu because we have a flu season every year. And there, other than sort of public service announcements, reminding people that they should get flu shots. And of course, we always get an email at Albright
Mhm.
reminding students, faculty, and staff that they can get the flu shot on campus at the health center. We don't hear that much about flu. I think because it's sort of a seasonal event. We're just used to it. Everybody grew up with the flu. One of the remarkable things about writings, right? If we look back at writings from patients, families, public health authorities, physicians about the 1918 flu is a surprise, right? That something that we were so used to now became something else
Right.
that seemed to kill very quickly. So the strain changed, we think. That also leads to the question, what can today public health authorities do to make people more aware of the dangers of seasonal flu? I mean, we've had a little bit about how now with COVID-19 that people should take extra care to get a flu shot to help, you
Mhm.
know, perhaps as the flu coming in as an opportunistic infection if someone has COVID or preventative. But yes, it's a problem. And no one gets excited about flu. It doesn't receive a lot of coverage in today's media. But
Right.
yes, if we look at the mortality statistics, it should excite us. We should pay more attention.
And hopefully one of the things that comes out of this, Hillary, and I don't know because it involves human behavior and human behavior is always unpredictable. That being said, if there was maybe a little more mask wearing, especially among the susceptible populations like the elderly, for influenza infection, maybe there'll be a little more awareness on hand hygiene or mask wearing or distancing for certain populations moving forward. One can only hope, right?
Yes, yes.
So speaking of that, so this is just a little bit of data that I pulled off the web, and this is looking at hospitalizations for pneumonia and influenza by age group, and this is pretty representative of just normal seasonal flu, where again it tends to be most severe. So number of hospitalizations on the axis, and this also would line up with mortality or death rates. It tends to be most severe in the very young, and over here on the right hand side in the very, well, not very old, but in older individuals, so 65 or older. But I mean, the older you are, the more risk. And then in the middle, it tends to be controlled, relatively mild infection. Okay. Now, what was and this will provide a little bit of a backdrop for our future discussion today. What was really interesting and unique about the 1918 flu pandemic, as you can see in this graph, looking at the death rate. So this is just showing in a dashed line a seasonal flu from a few years prior, and it follows what you would expect. It's more severe in the young, mild in sort of adolescents, young adults, middle-aged individuals, and then in older Americans, it spiked back up again in terms of death rate. You can see in 1918, 1919, that pandemic, it was severe, in the young and old, but also it was really severe in sort of people that were about 20 to 40 years old, which is not expected and very, very unique. And then this is a picture that I showed in my class. I forget where it's from. This is from, I believe, like a stadium or something. And it just sort of overwhelmed the healthcare industry and hospitals and things of that nature. You can just see all this, these beds of sick people. This is showing the sort of age expectancy, so the life expectancy. And you can see that as we would think, it's going up over time, right? As healthcare and public health improves, nutrition improves, all kinds of things, we're living longer. But look at that dramatic dip around 1918, 1919, from people dying of this. This is just a newspaper clipping that I found. It's kind of grainy, but I was having trouble finding newspaper clippings in my Google image searching when I put this together. But I mean, you kind of get the gist, right? So churches, schools, shows closed, epidemic puts ban on all public assemblies. So we can kind of touch on that to the current pandemic. And then my understanding, Hilary, is that it hit Philadelphia particularly hard. So maybe we'll put a pin in that and kind of come back to that because it's a regional significance. But this is a picture that's from Philadelphia, and it's pretty morbid, right? You can see here spit spreads death. And there was apparently a lot of anti-spitting laws that came out around that time.
Yeah, so a couple of things. Oh, I'm glad
Yeah,
you.
and then the last thing I was going to say is that this is apparently, from what I've read, this is sort of a children's sort of like a nursery rhyme or kind of a little tune they might sing while they were playing. And it says, "I had a little bird and its name was Enza. I opened the window and influenza."
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, Hilary, go ahead.
Okay. So you said so many things. I'm not sure which I should start with. So the mortality rate. So there were lots of things happening at the same time. Not the least of which was sort of World War I, right? So we had a lot of movement of peoples. So we had troop movement between the United States and Europe and other parts of the world. In Europe itself, we had soldiers. We had both soldiers and the civilian population that had undergone an extended period of stress, of malnutrition, of most likely overcrowded living conditions. I think all of these things contributed to these mortality rates. We talked a little bit earlier before we started our meeting about the possibility, the idea that people who were a little bit older already had some immunity to part of, right, the 1918 strain.
Right.
So they've identified.
Can I just ask? So my understanding was the H1N1. Is that correct?
Yes.
Oh,
So
yeah, yes,
so
yeah.
influenza A, H1N1, when they've analyzed samples of from bodies that have been buried, right, in a cold climate, they could extract a sample and analyze it. Okay, now this is sort of important, and I'll let you explain.
Well, I only put it up because you mentioned, which is a good time to bring it up. So thank you. Is this HN thing, right? So you always hear about that in any kind of news coverage of this or any kind of article. The H and the N. So without getting into the weeds of the biology, they're the two major surface proteins on the virus are called hemagglutinin or HA and neuraminidase for NA. And basically HA is what allows the virus to enter a cell, and NA is what helps the virus leave the cell. So, but because they're surface molecules, it's used by scientists to identify the strain. And one of the things that I wanted to touch on briefly, and Hilary asked if I was going to cover it, so I wanted to make sure to just sort of mention this here, and this will be kind of the last of the biology background, is influenza is a really interesting virus. So it has an RNA genome, which is similar to coronaviruses. So they both have an RNA genome. What's interesting though, coronaviruses have essentially one long continuous sort of uninterrupted genome. So that RNA is continuous and uninterrupted for a coronavirus. Whereas in influenza viruses, it's called segmented. And so you can see here in this image that the genome that makes up that virus is in different discrete pieces or segments. And that's interesting for its biology because in this example, you could have two different strains of influenza infect a single cell. And then while that virus is replicating, when those viruses assemble to become an infectious virus again and then leave the cell, it can just sort of randomly sort of mix and match those segments. And we've also discussed on previous episodes with Josh that, you know, RNA viruses are notorious for mutating. And so this virus, like all RNA viruses, can mutate when it's trying to replicate. It introduces mistakes. And so that's called genetic drift, which is just sort of an accumulation of what are called point mutations, just mistakes when it's replicating the genome. But shift is also called reassortment. So you can reassort or shift. And that's when you have this mixing and matching of these genome segments. So in this example, one virus was H2N2, the other virus was H3N, X, it doesn't matter. And you can see that with this reassortment or shift, the virus that came out is H3N2. So it picked up a different genome segment and now became H3N2. And that can have implications on the biology. It can have implications on the type of infection, on the spread, on the disease course. And so that's why it matters. And so this is the last slide here I wanted to show. And so this primarily happens in animal reservoirs that people in the field call mixing vessels. The two most common are pigs or swine and birds. So birds can be infected and pigs can be infected with a large array of different kinds of influenza viruses. Humans, it's a little more restricted, but some animal species like pigs and birds can be affected with many, many strains. And so in these animals, if they happen to get infected with multiple strains, you can have that genetic shift happen in those animals and potentially create new pandemic strains. And then here, the last image that I show my class is that in certain parts of the world where there's really close contact with humans and these mixing vessels, such as wildlife markets or farms, it has the potential to kind of spread into humans. So Hilary, so feel free to comment, but that's kind of like my little overview of the biology of the virus.
Yeah, so it's also because of the biology of influenza, it makes public health's job very difficult, right? Because they have to use epidemiological models to predict what strain of influenza virus is going to hit us in terms of seasonal flu. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong. And this sort of leads to an interesting question. I'm always interested in media coverage and people who respond to media. So Twitter, Facebook posts, et cetera, from the public. And I see a lot of, why do they always get it wrong?
Mm-hmm.
So this leads to the ability of public health officials to be able to explain a rather complicated aspect of biology to the general public, which I don't know that they do a great job of. It might help if people understood why it's so difficult to get the vaccine right. But it also requires sort of a basic knowledge of a certain level of scientific literacy. So in 1918, there of course was no vaccine because the causative agent wasn't discovered until the 1930s. So we had germ theory, bacteriological revolution, the end of the 1800s, the early 1900s, that led to the specificity of disease, but not for influenza. So what was available in the arsenal of tools to control the spread of this now new form of influenza, and interestingly, was basically not dissimilar to the tool chest of today, right? So masking, there was no unified federal response to the 1918 pandemic in the United States. Interestingly, influenza in 1918 was not a reportable disease. So there weren't great statistics on it. Basically, public health utilized existing language to be able to quarantine people because it was not a quarantinable disease, but they in some ways manipulated the existing language to be able to do that. So the response varied from place to place. It was basically left to both state and municipal public health authorities to decide in what ways they wanted to handle the epidemic. So for example, in New York City, Royal Copeland was the head of the Department of Health, and he was very concerned about not causing panic amongst the public. So he, in many ways, delayed some kind of response for the city. Now, San Francisco had the opposite response. They implemented masking. Eventually, New York does implement some programs. So you had anti-spitting. You brought that up before. That's actually was a holdover from the anti-tuberculosis campaign.
Okay.
That's when it first became an issue. It becomes magnified in the influenza pandemic. So no spitting, no coughing or sneezing without using a handkerchief at the time. Some cities implemented mask requirements, others did not. But they told people, wash your hands. Don't put things in your mouth, including your fingers or any other objects. Almost all municipalities banned the common drinking cup, which I like to talk about in class because the idea of multiple unrelated people sharing sort of a public drinking cup is really...
Where would one have a public drinking cup? I'm curious. I've never heard of this.
Really?
No.
Yeah. So it just in communities, if someone was, it was before water fountains. So, you scoop it up. So masking, hand washing, also saying, try to avoid crowds and quote unquote stuffy places. So try to be outdoors. If you have to be indoors, open a window, which people were somewhat reluctant to do in wintertime when it was cold out. Mm-hmm. So basically very similar to what we're telling people today. And in some municipalities, you could be arrested, and people were arrested en masse for, in some cases, not wearing masks, for spitting. Okay, and they were brought to the police station and had to pay fines. Okay. So again, not a unified response. So you mentioned Philadelphia. So there's an interesting comparison between Philadelphia and St. Louis. So in Philadelphia, the flu had been spreading around for about 10 days, but Philadelphia allowed for a Liberty War Bond parade to take place on Broad Street. Okay. That drew in about 200,000 people. St. Louis.
I see where you're going with that. I see.
Yeah. St. Louis had the opposite response. When they had 3 days of increased influenza reporting, they shut down. They shut down schools. They banned public gatherings. Philadelphia did eventually, but by that time, the flu had been more widespread. So it hit Philadelphia really badly. Again, in another parallel, if people remember, in New York City, there were shots on the news of trucks, refrigerated trucks with bodies, because funeral parlors could not process the bodies. They were overwhelmed with so many deceased people. The same thing happened in Philadelphia. They couldn't get enough coffin makers to build coffins for all the people who had died. I mean, in essence, the city shut down because you either had so many people were ill that the infrastructure of the city couldn't run, right?
Yeah.
You know, when you have at that time police officers, fire, healthcare providers, teachers, members of local government, all sick or tending to members of their families who were sick, how can society function? So quickly overwhelmed the city of Philadelphia.
Right. And Hilary, I wanted to ask, so I've read a little bit that there were sort of two waves. Can you comment briefly on that? There were like sort of two waves, and the second one was more severe than the first, I guess.
I think most historians think there were 4 waves.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, so spring of 1918, August of 1918, the following winter of 1919, and then early 1920.
And so the conditions you were describing in Philadelphia was like really bad. When would that have been approximately?
In the spring and August, I think, of 1918. So it's interesting because other places, for example, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, everything shut down and things stayed shut down. So the other problem was you had shutdowns. So as I said before, St. Louis shut down. They were more proactive than Philadelphia earlier on. Their rates went down. Then they opened things up again and they got hit again, which is not dissimilar to what we're living through at this moment in time, right? And we could kind of see both in 1918 and today, we could see it moving, right, across the country, right? So in today, New York got hit first, other big cities got hit, and then you have now smaller cities and towns, as I think North Dakota and South Dakota, Montana have very high rates. So it's interesting to see it move. So, I mean, in 1918, there were anti-maskers. There was an organization in San Francisco of people who argued that masks were unconstitutional.
Okay.
Most of the masks were made of gauze then. So, I mean, I think that there's evidence that shows that even gauze masks helped slow down the spread.
Especially if it's several layers thick, probably going to help a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah. But there were people who were against it, and it was a coalition of all different types of people, physicians. There were some members of the public health community who questioned the efficacy of masks, but it wasn't tied necessarily to one particular political party versus another, as I would say today it is. The biggest controversy, at least, or debate, I should say, amongst public health officials in the 1919 was the closing of schools.
Yeah. So that was on my list. I'm glad you brought that up. So what did they do with schools?
Shut them down, and there was no, obviously, there was no remote learning.
Right. Exactly.
So, you know, parents, I suppose, did the best they could in you know, helping their children at home, just like they are today. But yeah, that was these are difficult decisions that have to be made. I mean, interestingly, I just recently heard a discussion of sort of local school board leaders saying that they feel they've been forced to make a decision that should be made by public health authorities and the government. And it's fallen on local school districts to make that call.
Mhm.
as whether they're going to have face-to-face or remote or blended. So this sort of gets into the discussion of the relationship between citizens and the government, right? So in state formation, you get, or the development of what some people call biopolitics. So it's the state interceding in the lives of the citizenry. And public health is the best example of that, right? But it's also the citizenry having expectations of the state to protect them. So it's an intertwining of two rights and responsibilities and expectations.
So in 1918 versus today, in terms of public health response, it's sounds like it was a similar type of thing where it's, because of federalism, I suppose, and because of states having their own governments and somewhat, a little bit of autonomy, it's sort of a state by state or city by city response, I guess, similar to today, right?
Yes.
Which I wasn't aware of. I didn't realize that, even 100 years ago, it was a similar type of system, with respect to public health measures.
Well, the American Public Health Association only formed in the 1870s. So it hadn't been around very long.
Was that in response to any particular pathogen like tuberculosis or smallpox, or was there like, one pathogen that kind of drove that formation?
So, I mean, the interesting, looking at the history of public health in the United States is of itself an interesting topic, because what is now the United States Public Health Service, right? And the reason why it's a uniform service is because it basically emerged from a military model, right? So it was the Marine Hospital Service in the late 1700s, and it changes its name and eventually becomes the United States Public Health Service. But its leaders wear what look like military uniforms because that's the model. And even the CDC, right, formed sort of post-World War II. So it was really tuberculosis, I would argue, that led to the American Public Health Association's formation, because what's interesting in the United States is the work of voluntary associations, particularly the Anti-Tuberculosis Association, which was headquartered, it really begins in Philadelphia because of the work of Lawrence Flick, that they took on a lot of public health work, and eventually it moves to a federal infrastructure with state and county and municipal outposts. But I think another thing, what we didn't do after 1918 is a problem now, which is we didn't strengthen the public health infrastructure in the United States. We still have not had really a federal unified response to COVID-19. It's basically been left up to governors and mayors to make decisions, which is good and bad. I mean, I personally feel there's some things that should be mandated federally, and then you should have flexibility of response depending on the condition in a particular city or a particular state.
Yeah, the people sort of quote unquote on the front lines know their communities best. And
yes.
So, yeah, perhaps putting a framework in place and then they can operate within that framework. I agree. I think that would be the best solution.
And also, there is no local public health office in Berks County,
right?
Or Lancaster County, which is where I live.
Okay.
And that's very problematic. And it's been highlighted, and local politicians have spoken about this, how it would have been helpful for better coordination to also have a local infrastructure.
Right.
Well,
in terms on the scientific side, to kind of go off what you're saying, which is interesting, on like just say for example, like funding, right? Like if you look at the NIH funding, coronaviruses because, we've had seasonal coronaviruses in the population for probably centuries, certainly decades. And, they don't really cause much more than a common cold. And so there really hasn't been a lot of funding on coronavirus biology. Now, fast forward, you've got SARS back in 2003-ish, but it only, I say only, it only killed about 8,000 people and it fizzled out pretty quickly. And there was all this kind of like temporary hysteria, and then it died away, and so did the funding. And then fast forward to about 2010, 2012 to today, there's something called Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome virus that comes from camels in the Middle East. That can be really dangerous if it gets into humans. Luckily, it doesn't really spread very well from human to human, but it could happen. There could be a change in mutation. We should research that more, right? And then now, here we are, SARS-CoV-2, the cousin of SARS-1, if you will, causing all this disruption and mayhem. And so, I think we could have been, both on the public health side of things and on the scientific side of things, unfortunately been more proactive and less reactionary. And here we are. So hopefully, Hilary, we will learn something from this, but only time will tell, I guess, right?
Yes, and I would like to put in a plug for what I would call sort of health democracy in action. And that's the idea that average citizens have a certain amount of power in that they can pressure their representatives, right? First, they have to find out which of their members of Congress sit on committees that decide funding for things like the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health. And then they can pressure them to fund research into these areas. So the tragedy is that many people have lost loved ones to COVID-19. And after they get over their grief, I would encourage them to become activists, to campaign for more funding for research into these areas, both on the scientific side and the public health side, in terms of educating the public so that we can not have this happen again. Because in the interconnectedness of our world, so there was interconnectedness in 1918 that I mentioned before, a lot of movement of peoples because of the war and displacements, movements of troops, movements of support personnel. Today, of course, it's air travel, but we also have the environmental destruction, right? So we're coming in closer contact in many parts of the world with animals. So this can lead to the emergence of new pathogens that we have not seen before.
And honestly, right now, I mean, SARS-CoV-2 came from a bat, so what you're saying is absolutely true. Ebola comes from bats. I feel like bats get a bad rap, but anyway, that's a whole nother discussion.
Our provost would take issue with that, Adam.
No, so what you said is absolutely right on point. That as we get in closer contact with our brethren, if you will, in the animal kingdom, more chance of having a zoonotic crossover event. Absolutely.
Yes, and it's also important for us not to ignore public health infrastructure in other countries in the developing world, right? Because we live in such a connected society. So what happens to people in other parts of the world can affect us. So we're all members of the same planet Earth. So behoove us to care more for folks in other countries as well as our own health.
Right. And just for our listeners, sort of a tangible example of what I'm talking about in terms of being prepared. When SARS hit in 2003, we could have, for the last 20 years ish, been working on a small molecule inhibitor, some kind of drug. We could have been, trying to find a drug that inhibits coronavirus replication and hammering that home, and potentially done even clinical trials and had a stockpile of some sort of broad coronavirus drug. That's just an example of some research that could have been done, that we could have been more prepared, whether it's on the vaccine front, on the drug front, or on the public awareness, stockpiling PPE, communication networks on the public side, all kinds of things on multiple fronts that, in theory, looking in backwards, we should have been doing.
Yes.
So Hilary, it's something that popped in my head. So I was doing some reading, and just, and this goes from just stuff I've tried to accumulate over the years. So you mentioned about World War I and the military. Did a lot of the outbreaks in this country originate from like barracks or military bases? Do you know, or do you kind of know, like, what was sort of the events that sort of allowed it to kind of simmer before it went as a full blown outbreak? Do you know?
I think one of the first outbreaks was at a military installation in Kansas.
Oh, right. I heard about that. Yeah.
And then some of the first reported cases were amongst members of the Navy in Boston,
Okay.
and then start to see popping up at other naval bases, right, in the United States, like the Great Lakes Naval Base in Chicago, New Orleans, et cetera, Mobile, Alabama, other cases. So,
okay. And so you have those close quarters, right, of the barracks and everything, and then they can spread it, and then spread it to the world, right, during World War I.
Right. Yeah. So I'll just a little side thing is sort of the virus origin story, as I like to call it.
Okay.
So it was incorrectly labeled the Spanish flu, and that mainly had to do with the fact that during World War I, the United States, Great Britain, and France censored their news. So they did not publish anything about any influenza outbreaks.
Is this related to the Sedition Act, Hilary?
Pardon?
Is this related to the Sedition Act that I've heard about? Is that about that same time period?
Yes, the Sedition Act. Yeah.
Was that a response to the pandemic, or you know what I mean? The Sedition Act, where you couldn't say anything bad about,
No.
No.
I think that was. I think it was in place before.
Okay, but they kind of used that potentially.
Yes.
Okay.
Spain was neutral during World War I.
Okay.
So they did publish information about influenza, so it got sort of mislabeled the Spanish flu. Plus, the King of Spain contracted, which also publicized it more, as we talked about before we started this meeting. We believe Woodrow Wilson, who was president of the United States at the time, most likely contracted influenza while he was in Paris negotiating the peace treaty. He never publicized that, and he never addressed the American public about the pandemic.
He never did, really?
No.
Oh, wow, I didn't know that.
But the pandemic, I mean, some more similarities are the level of suffering. So not only of people who became sick and died and their family members, but also of medical personnel, particularly nurses, right? Their doctors couldn't do anything. They had no treatment for influenza. So in many ways, nurses took on the role of comforting the patient, right? All the medical community could do was make the patient feel comfortable, try to give them fluids. Whereas today, we have antibiotics to fight off secondary infections like bacterial pneumonia, right? And those didn't exist in 1918. So a lot of the writings reflect the suffering, right? Not only of loss of loved ones, but just the toll it took on health providers, and particularly nurses, because they were the ones that had more interaction with the patients and what they saw. And I think that's true today when we 100 years from now, when we write the history of COVID-19, and many historians and history organizations have asked people to chronicle their experiences, not only healthcare providers, but just the average citizen, school children, college students. I had my students write in my FYS, what was it like graduating high school and starting college during a pandemic, right? So these are the things that historians will look to later on to try and piece together the experiences of not only politicians, medical personnel, but just the average citizen and how they experience a pandemic in modern times. Of course, we have more information at our fingertips. 1918, people got their information from the newspaper. Some people still do today, but we also, of course, have the internet, which has some correct and a lot of incorrect information on it. So,
Hilary, what would you say? So I've heard some people say that, well, it's like, SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19 is not a big deal. So how do you respond to somebody like that?
well, I think if we look at the mortality rates of the seasonal flu, for example, because that's what I've heard people saying, it's just like the flu, and COVID-19, we see some stark differences. There's a much higher mortality rate. And we also see things, I mean, the problem is, and we're seeing it again, is our healthcare system becoming overwhelmed, right? And I don't really understand why people can't see that as problematic.
Mm-hmm.
Not only does my local hospital have to treat COVID patients, and the rates have been going up locally in Lancaster. They only have so many ventilators if we get extreme cases. There's only so many healthcare personnel in this area, and they've been going full steam since March. Some of them are getting burned out, some of them are getting sick. But the hospital also has to treat other people. People still are having heart attacks, they're still having babies, right? They're still breaking legs. So that alone should make us concerned, and people should understand that they're part of a community. So for your local community, wear a mask. Try to social distance as much as possible. I'm particularly concerned about the holidays.
And also college students going back home, right?
Yes. I just had my last public health class yesterday, and that's what I ended with. I said, for you guys who aren't already at home, please think about wearing a mask if your grandparents are coming over for Thanksgiving, or you're interacting with medically vulnerable people, because you could be an asymptomatic, have COVID, not know it, and unwittingly pass it to a loved one. I said, I know it sounds crazy, but it's not that burdensome just to wear a mask in your house if you're around vulnerable people who are not sort of in your pod that you haven't been interacting with, for a while.
Right, but you're right. That's a good point. It's so contagious, right? It's just the sheer number of people infected. It can overwhelm, especially a smaller healthcare system.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah, because it is so contagious, and it's hard to control because hence, as you were saying, wear a mask and distance, because just like flu. So there are some similarities. Flu can spread when someone is pre-symptomatic, so they're not experiencing any signs or symptoms yet, and yet they're contagious. And obviously we know that's true for SARS-CoV-2 as well, and it just makes it really hard to control the spread. So we're really fighting an uphill battle here, unfortunately.
Yes, and I actually was just rereading some letters that are in a text that I sometimes use for my history of medicine class about the 1918 pandemic. And it was the fact that the shock of the rapidity with which someone in 1918 who contracted that particular strain of influenza went downhill. So it wasn't a slow onset of symptoms, which we'll often see in seasonal flu.
Mhm.
They were fine. They got all the symptoms, and 24 hours later, they were dead. And we've seen some of that with COVID. And I mean, there's been discussion of age and pre-existing conditions
Mhm.
as perhaps making it worse, but there's also cases of this happening, unfortunately, to young people. So the fact that we don't know enough about it should make people overly cautious, I think.
Right. Okay. Do you think we hit all this stuff that, I want that. So in your so would you say that we should stop calling it Spanish flu then? Is that
Yeah, uh, um, I would say we should stop calling it Spanish flu. And yeah, because so we tend to look at these as foreign invaders, and often they get attached to a particular country or ethnic group, which in the past has led to really the spread of discrimination,
Sure.
and in some cases outright attacks against members that people think are part of that group that is getting the blame.
Yeah, that's a good point. In the virology community, I think there's some push, and I think it's gaining steam to stop naming viruses after like countries or cities or things of that nature.
Yes.
So yeah, no, it's always good to be aware, right? And to try to think ahead about some of the stuff and be aware of our sisters and brothers around the world. So absolutely. So yeah, do you think that we hit on everything that you wanted to bring up? It's super interesting stuff.
Um, yes, although I would add the sort of burden that's been placed upon, I think, women, both in 1918 and today. So in 1918, the caretaking was mostly done by women. And to a certain extent, that hasn't changed that much, although certainly in the medical profession, obviously, there are male nurses, but still the majority are female. But I mean, some of the information that's coming out about mostly women having to deal with homeschooling, or I should say remote learning of children now, and trying to maybe work from home, or they have a full-time job outside the home, then they have to help their children learn. Also, even I've read articles about women in academia whose research has to be on hold because they simply don't have time to do their job, do research, help their children remote learn all at the same time. So there is a gendered aspect to the workload that comes with living through a pandemic.
It's an interesting point. Yeah, yeah. Again, awareness, right? Self-reflection. These are all things important for society. Um, so yeah, thank you for bringing that up.
I will also say there's no that I know of any sort of public memorial to the victims of the 1918 pandemic.
Hmm.
We've kind of had historic amnesia about it, not necessarily within the history of medicine community, because we teach about it regularly.
Yeah.
You never hear about it until now. Now people seem to be interested in the 1918 pandemic. So I hope that that interest spurs people to look at what we could have done better after that pandemic and didn't do, and do it now.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Because the next pandemic will happen. It's not a matter of if, but when.
Mm-hmm.
As we were discussing earlier, my own bias is that it's probably going to be another respiratory pathogen. So we should pay extra attention to respiratory infections, and or it could be, and it could be something that we already kind of know about. Like we already kind of knew about flu, we kind of knew about coronaviruses, right? But it could, in theory, be something completely novel that we've really never seen before. So yeah, I mean, every 10 to 20 years, it seems like there's some episode that sparks some awareness and some fear and anxiety. Luckily, SARS-1 in 2003, it kind of fizzled out. You know, what was it? What were you saying earlier, Hilary? Was it 2009-ish for the avian flu?
Yeah, H1N1.
Yeah, the avian flu. That luckily didn't. I mean, it spread, but it didn't luckily cause as near a disruption as this one. But yeah, it's going to happen. It's going to happen again. So
Probably sooner rather than later, I suspect.
yes, unfortunately. So all right. Well, this is like I was I was joking. I could do this all day. I've been looking at viruses for about 15 years now from grad school on, and I think they're really interesting. And it's nice to be at a small liberal arts college where we can use these circumstances now to hopefully help educate people, but also pull in some expertise from people who think about this in a different from a different angle, which is really interesting. So Josh and I've been trying to do that, and I've learned a lot. I've enjoyed it. So.
Yes, thank you for inviting me. It's great
Yeah.
to be able to give some historical perspective on understanding a current pandemic.
Yeah, I think history is really interesting. My wife unfortunately doesn't agree. Well, whenever we go like to some tourist spot or something, I'm always the one like reading the sign that they have and reading about all the background information. And she's like, "Come on, let's go." I definitely like history a lot. I ended up being a biochemistry major in college, but I took some more than the required minimum of history courses as like electives.
Oh, great.
So yeah, very, very interesting. But thank you for taking the time. And I wanted to before we signed off, I have about 8 to 10 of these plush giant microbes around my office. So this is influenza here. But it can actually come when it leaves cells, it can come off kind of like a sphere, but sometimes it can come off kind of filamentous. And so this is sort of an homage to the filamentous form of flu here. So anyway, so it's saying goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you so much for for joining us and sharing your expertise. I appreciate it.
Thank you for the invitation. I appreciate
Okay, take care. Bye.
it. Bye.